Hello and welcome to this Evershed Sutherland PROPcast. I'm Anna Woodford, professional support lawyer to the real estate practice group here at Evershed Sutherland. I'll be joined in a moment by Ian Owen, who's a partner in our real estate practice group, specialising in complex development, investment and funding work. Our subject today is single family housing build to rent from an investor's perspective and the legal challenges that we are coming across in this area. Ian has been at the forefront of this market as institutional investor demand has emerged and developed over the last few years.
Thanks, Anna, and hi everybody. It's great to see such a good turnout this morning. So, thank you all for joining us.
So, Ian, let's start with a bit of background. Firstly, what do we mean when we're talking about single family BTR, single family build to rent?
Yeah, an easy one to start with. So, a single family build to rent, it sits alongside the much more established multifamily BTR sector. The basic difference, of course, is that you're just dealing with standalone houses, typically on a suburban estate, rather than a large city centre apartment block. These houses are owned and operated by professional investor landlords, and then let out to the general public. They are built to rent, and we've seen a huge increase in this market since it started to emerge around 5 years or so ago. As a firm, we've dealt with over 3.5 units now in this space, and we're seeing a really, really strong pipeline for 2025.
Why do you think we've seen this big growth?
There's a few reasons for it, and I'm sure the reasons are going to be very familiar for quite a few people on the session. You've got the affordability problem first, of course, with the increase in interest rates, the widening of the ratio between house prices and income. You've got the retraction of the individual landlord as they've been battered over the last couple of years by regulation, changes in tax policy. But thirdly, I think specifically for single family, you've got a change in demand. People, like young families, empty nesters, they're looking for a house rather than an apartment. They want a community feel. They want access to open space that you don't have in city centres. But fundamentally, as we know, people can't get on the housing ladder, and with individual landlords selling up quickly, the institutional landlords are piling in really to fill the gap.
So, what sort of transactions are you seeing coming across your desk?
It's a real mix, but both development and investment deals predominantly. In simple terms, I say on the development side, we're seeing clients buying houses that haven't yet been constructed, or those that perhaps are in the middle of being constructed. And then on the investment side, clients are buying existing houses that have already been let to the general public. They are buying effectively an operating business in that situation.
So if we start with the development deals, could you give us some more detail on how those work?
Yeah, of course. So, the clients are effectively building partnerships with different house builders. That's national and regional house builders on the development side. And they're transacting really in three different ways. You've got forward commitment deals first, you've got forward funding deals, and then slightly less so collaboration and sort of joint venture agreements. So maybe if I take each one of those in turn and perhaps give everybody a little bit of a background on each of those structures, just as a reminder. Forward commitments, those are deals where the investor buys the houses once they've been constructed. That's when everything's been properly built. It's the most straightforward type of deal that we see. It's the safest option for an investor, but it does come with higher levels of stamp duty and a price as a result of that. Second, we've got forward funding deals where an investor buys typically bare land. They simultaneously then enter into a development agreement with a house builder, and the houses are then built in return for stage payments, usually then with a back end profit and when everything's completed. Those sorts of deals, investors tend to get a better price, but there is more risk to factor into those sorts of transactions. And then the third way is joint ventures and collaboration agreements, where typically on deals that haven't yet got planning, we're seeing investors and house builders working together to bring forward schemes, and they're sharing the risk and reward depending upon how much they put into the project. But ultimately, the way in which a deal will be structured is very much dependent upon the fact pattern of the particular circumstances and the risk appetite of an investor.
Mm-hmm. So if that's a sort of where the development deals get structured, what happens on the investment side?
I mean, as I said before, predominantly clients are buying into stabilised platforms, often buying large, bulky portfolios of existing stock, and we're finding they're doing that in a way that enables them to build scale in their businesses really quickly. There's a huge appetite for single family BTR at the moment, and clients want to grab hold of that as much as they can.
And once you actually get into the deals, what kind of issues and challenges are you seeing?
The main challenge is really getting over the difference in approach and requirements. Many of the house builders and their solicitors have been doing their thing for for many years, perhaps in a particular way, and that can be perhaps very different from the way in which investors have been approaching, say, multifamily deals over the last decade. The house builders and the investors, can sometimes come at it in a slightly different way. I'll have different expectations around the deal, and there can sometimes be a bit of a clash of worlds that needs to be navigated carefully.
So obviously you've got sort of two parties with quite kind of entrenched traditional positions, and can you give us some examples of some of the problems that you've come across that have come out of that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the problems really flow back, right to the way in which house builders buy land and then set it up for development. Their conventional business model, it isn't, traditionally designed to sell units in bulk to an investor. They'll be selling to Mr. and Mrs. Smith or a registered social landlord. So, that creates some inherent problems, and maybe a few examples of that. The first would be planning permissions and Section 106 agreements. They aren't being phased yet in a way that anticipates this type of exit. And that's a particular issue when you're using the forward funding model. An investor can find themselves in a position where they're buying land, buying bare land, and then they become directly responsible by being the landowner for the payment of Section 106 contributions. Those might be site-wide Section 106 contributions, that they might become liable to deliver affordable housing on land that they don't own or control. So that can be very, very uncomfortable for an investor or its funder, even with an indemnity from a house builder. We see similar issues with things like overage, where house builders agreed in the very normal way, of course, to pay overage to a former landowner, or perhaps where a house builder is working in collaboration with another house builder and they've agreed to undertake certain works for the wider project. Those sorts of obligations we're seeing as being attached to land by the house builders, not seeing the carve outs yet that perhaps we have seen traditionally for RSLs and the registered social landlords. Investors are being left in a position where they're being asked to take on these responsibilities directly, because they buy the land and then rely upon an indemnity back from the developer. And as I said, really uncomfortable positions for a developer traditionally. It can often lead to increases in things like stamp duty that haven't perhaps been thought about, and that will ultimately impact the price that house builders can achieve if these sorts of deals aren't structured properly right from the beginning.
So I guess it'll be interesting to see as this market grows, if the house builders start to change their land acquisition model in the future to reflect the change in their exit strategy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as the market continues to grow, certainly as we've seen over the last couple of years, and single family BTR becomes a much more established part of the house builders exit strategy, I think it's inevitable. House builders will want to avoid these sorts of issues, repeating themselves time and time again.
And presumably as well, you're finding that investors have got different requirements from the house builders' usual buyers, the Mr. and Mrs. Smith plot buyers and RSLs.
Yeah, absolutely. They're vastly different.
Can you talk us through a few examples of those differences?
Yeah, so first off, I guess you'd say investors want absolute greater visibility on how units are being built. They want to stay in, and they'll want approval of the completion of the handover process. An investor's going to want enhanced controls on program to make sure they aren't handed over a whole load of units in one big lump sum. They'll want defined phases and parameters on the number of units that might be handed over each month, a minimum and a maximum. They don't want to be finding themselves with having to take on a whole load of units that impacts their marketing and let up strategy. House builders perhaps are at the other end of the spectrum, where they want complete flexibility and want to be able to hand over whatever units might be ready in a particular month. So that's the first issue. Second, we see investors particularly concerned about development blight. They will not want to be operating, a letting business next to a building site. And so, you start looking at the development and the handover program, really carefully. And then third, the house builders often try, we see even trying to impose breakup restrictions on these sorts of portfolios, restrictions on when units can be sold, whether the portfolio can be broken up. Clearly, the house builder wants to avoid a position where the investors' units are being sold in a way that competes with the open market sales. But investors need to maintain value and liquidity. That ultimately means being able to sell those units individually if needs be.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as well, we all know that house builders have very standard requirements when it comes to the terms that they sell units on, because they're looking to achieve uniformity across their estate. But presumably the requirements of an investor cut across that completely.
Yeah. The house builders, they will want to roll out their standard plot transfer. Absolutely, they'll absolutely want to do that. That's going to include lots of controls around things like alterations to the property. What does the property look like? What can it be used for? The transfer is going to limit redevelopment. All of those things give the house builder lots of control. It's the sort of things they're used to having, particularly in the early stages of a development. Well, other units are still to be constructed. But the investor's going to want to look at those. They're going to want to water them down and have some carve outs. Operationally, an investor's not going to want to have to get the consent of a house builder every time it wants to undertake a minor alteration, or perhaps stick up solar panels or something like that. Across a large portfolio, the hassle and cost of that at an operational level can mount up. And so we're seeing investors push very hard against those sorts of restrictions in standard plot transfers. The negotiation, therefore, of what can be, I guess, a relatively straightforward document ordinarily can sometimes be a real challenge.
That's interesting. Thank you. Going back to your comment on how you're seeing deals structured, you mentioned that there's a mix of both forward commits and forward funding transactions.
Yeah, as I say, seeing both sorts of transactions equally. Forward commits, again, just a reminder, you buy once you've built, or forward fundings where you buy bare land and then the units get constructed. Generally, the type of deal that we see boils down to the risk appetite of the investor and certainly the tax considerations. For many years, investors have been using forward funding, for example, when developing multifamily BTR. And so, we're now seeing that that sort of model being shoehorned into single family housing. It comes with additional risk and complexity and does move the house builders out of their comfort zone, but it's certainly something that we're seeing people push for.
But what would you say the risks of the forward funding model are?
With single family BTR, I mean, the risks stem fundamentally from the fact that investors are usually buying only part of a development site. That's very different from the traditional multifamily development, where an investor will board the whole development site and have full control of it. If the house builder fails to build, the investor's got to take control of the site, step in, and then complete the project itself, and that can be much more difficult with single family housing, where you might own a part of ownerships across the site and you only own therefore part of it. You've got to think about things like state roads, services, the other infrastructure that might need to be completed on land that you probably don't own or control. And that's true with things like site-wide planning conditions, site-wide planning works, or Section 106 obligations. Who is going to finish off those works if the house builder defaults? Are there different stakeholders who might have the same position or the same concerns if the house builder defaults? Do you need a priority agreement between those stakeholders to determine who's going to do the work? Who's going to carry the cost? Who's going to do them? There's a lot of things that probably need to be thought about there. How is the Section 38, the 104 agreements going to be signed if you don't own the estate roads? Cost is also a concern. Has the cost of those works been properly considered and factored into the appraisal? Typically, an investor will only be contributing towards part of the shared infrastructure. And so, where's the investor going to find the shortfall if it needs to build those things itself? Is there an adequate contingency? there really are some tricky issues that need to be navigated here.
Mm. So staying probably with the cost point, I mean, what about cost certainty? We know that in multifamily BTR, that's a relatively well-trodden path. Investors are used to seeing a single fixed price building contract with a third-party contractor. What's the position in single family BTR?
Yeah, as you say, that does give the single building contract. It gives investors cost certainty in multi-family for sure. If the house builder defaults, the investor, they've still got their third party contractor who can finish the job for them. But getting cost certainty on single family BTR can be a challenge. The house builders do operate a different model. Typically, they will not have a single contractor, but they'll have a series of different contractors who are appointed to undertake various different packages of work across the sites. And those packages, they'll often relate to the whole estate, right, rather than just the units that are being acquired. So sadly, there isn't a single construction package that can be stepped into that's going to give real cost certainty. Another problem is that with that is that it creates issue around cost overruns. If you've not got a single building contract, how do you identify those cost overruns during the build process? When do you impose a freeze on the ability of the house builder to draw down because they've gone over budget? Where there's multiple packages of works, it's really difficult to try and determine or identify where that cost overrun is. And then also the investor, in the usual way for them, will want to interrogate what's being paid to the house builder. What are the sums made up of? It will want to look at the detail behind the contract sum analysis on an open book basis, and that the house builders can often be hesitant to reveal perhaps the magic behind their numbers. There can be a real tension there for sure between the investor and the house builder.
Mm. So obviously that's all around the sort of cost certainty point. Are there any other particular risks on the forward funding model?
Maybe just one more for today. So, insurance, that's also problematic. Investor, they're going to be paying for works on the drip as they're carried out. Will therefore want to make sure in the usual way that those works are insured, and that if they burn down or are damaged, that the investor's got access to some insurance proceeds to make sure that the reinstatement's undertaken. Investors going to want to be composite insured. They'll want to be first loss payee under a contractors or risk policy. But often the house builders, they'll have a group-wide national policy, and that won't be set up in a way that allows that. Insurance is therefore something that we would need to look at really closely. But the upshot really with forward funding in this sort of market is that sometimes it can be like trying to fit a large square peg into what is a very small round hole. It can be a challenge, and you do need to come up with some innovative solutions.
But obviously these deals are getting done. So how are investors managing to mitigate these problems?
Yeah, a few ways. I mean, just to give you guys a flavour, so adapting payment profiles to factor in risk. We're seeing fixed payments at particular stages of development, perhaps rather than monthly valuations of the contract sum analysis. Increasing the amount of back-end profit payments, levels of retention. Some investors are delaying land purchase until there's more certainty on site-wide infrastructure. They'll only buy the land once that's all in. It becomes obviously therefore much lesser of a concern. But the overarching point on these sorts of deals is that the investors are very looking really closely at financial covenant strength of the house builders. They'll be looking for top co guarantees, bonds, other levels of security. But trying to price in the risk can be a challenge. The house builders, are being paid to take development risk. Their profit will be anticipating that, but some of these deals and the way in which they're structured can mean that there's an element of development risk for an investor, which is something they're not used to seeing.
Mm. With that in mind, though, do you think that forward funding is a model that's here to stay?
Yeah, I do, but not in the way perhaps the investors are used to seeing it in multifamily. It can be very different with single family BTR. With the abolition of multiple dwelling relief, of course, which was the major advantage of forward commitments. Investors do want to use the forward funding model. It gives them a better deal, and for the house builders, it enables them to recycle capital at an earlier stage. So it works for everybody if the structure could be made to work.
But the other option, though, is the forward commit structure. Are there any particular issues that you see on those?
Not to the same extent with forward funding deals. They are forward commitment deals are much more straightforward. But a couple of points. The house builders are pushing for deposits that exceed 10%. Deposits at that level are, a penalty, probably unenforceable in their entirety, and the level of NHBC or equivalent cover that you can get in the market typically only covers a 10% deposit. So, anything over that is going to be unacceptable usually to an investor. Second, problems around liquidated damages. Investors still look for those in forward commitment deals, but the house builders don't like it. You'll often have a big debate around the list of extension events, in the usual way, but that's really trying to push the development risk on program onto the investor, and so that can be a challenge. And then lastly, we're seeing reluctance from house builders to accept what an investor might think is its usual termination rights on insolvency and breach. So funder step-in provisions, measurement provisions, and a reluctance around price reductions for underbuilds. All of these sort of things are relatively normal in multifamily BTR, but in the single family BTR market, there's some tension trying to get those sort of provisions in a deal.
So you've talked us through the development deals, but you mentioned at the beginning that investors are also buying into stabilised stock, so units that are already built and let. What sort of issues and challenges do you see on those deals?
Yeah, a few issues. First, classic is the Tenant Fee Act. Many of the ASTs that we see perhaps aren't as compliant with the Tenant Fees Act as perhaps people think they are. That means that some of the payments that are sort of written into the contract perhaps aren't recoverable because of that act. Second, very much a legal point, but restrictions on title can be a real nightmare. They're very often poorly and incorrectly drafted. That's where you need to get a consent letter from a third party before a sale of the units can be registered at the land registry. A classic example being, a management company where they'll give you the piece of paper if the service charge has been paid. Those sorts of provisions are very standard in the residential market, but are very different from what an investor's used to seeing. That can create liquidity problems if we can't get that consent. Third, those sorts of issues become even more complex when you're buying the company that owns the stock. When you're doing a corporate, perhaps rather than an asset deal, investors can inherit any liability that sits within the target company. And when you're looking at potential criminal and civil liabilities, due diligence really does come into focus. Right to rent is the example that I'd give there. Often that position can be a real mess, and the target won't have properly passed down their liability to a property manager. So you get into really very granular checks on things like passports and immigration papers that can be really time consuming and difficult to get right. But the cost saving of buying the company has got to be outweighed against all these sorts of problems. There's other things, of course, like data protection, constant chasing regulation. I could go on, I'm sure, until tomorrow if you wanted me to.
I did say we'd stick to half an hour. Thank you. And that's a really good overview of the legal challenges of buying, funding, and developing single family homes. Just a few final questions from me before we wrap up. Firstly, the renters' rights bill's on the horizon. What's all that about?
Yeah, before the election, we saw, of course, the draft renters reform bill, and Labour looks like it's going to run with that. Some tweaks under the renters' rights bill. For me, when you're looking at it from an investor's perspective, the key points are, potentially the removal of the no-fault eviction ground. You've got the removal or the ground of persistent rent arrears. Those are all going to increase costs for an investor, and those costs are going to have to be passed down somehow. There's also a discussion around the introduction of a hardship test that's going to give courts the ability to refuse an eviction if a tenant is going to suffer a greater hardship than the landlord. When you're looking at an institutional investor who's trying to evict Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it's hard to see how that's going to work in a very fair way for the investor. I think it's going to be interesting. The government is going to have to listen to the industry's views on this. I hope anyway. I
guess time will probably tell on that. And my final question, you've touched on Labour's plans. There's obviously the budget coming up next month with some pretty well publicised proposals. Presumably that will shake things up and have an impact on this market as well.
Yeah, I mean, things are increasingly looking worse, aren't they, for individual landlords? They've been in the cross target of the government for some time now, and it looks like Labour's going to try and fill the £22 billion black hole they've identified with capital gains tax increases, potentially national insurance on rental income. Individual landlords, they've been selling up as a result of that, and it's inevitably going to mean an increase in rents, right? And as the stock reduces in the market. In my view, I guess it's a good thing that investors are therefore moving quickly into single family housing. They will be able to provide the much needed homes to the general public that are needed, and they'll do that, I suspect, in a much more professional and efficient manner than individual landlords have ever been able to do. The single family investor markets is here to stay, I think, in the long term, and that's certainly what I'm seeing as the number of deals on my desk sort of doubles year on year.
Thank you, Ian. That's been really interesting. And I think it's going to be quite fascinating to see how the market plays out in the coming years. Well, that brings us to the end of this Evershed Sutherland PROPcast. Thank you, everybody, for listening.